Imagine a darkness so absolute that sunlight has not touched it in over 2 millennia. Buried under millions of tons of packed earth in the heart of China, there is a sealed chamber that no living person has ever entered. The air inside is not air. It is a toxic fog, a slow-acting chemical death sentence left behind by a man who believed he could negotiate with eternity. This is the underground kingdom of Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of a unified China, a ruler who climbed to absolute power over mountains of corpses, and then spent his final years drinking mercury because his alchemists told him it was the elixir of the gods. For decades, the greatest archaeologists on Earth have circled this burial mound like wolves around a locked cage. The structure beneath the soil is larger than the Great Pyramid of Giza. Ground-penetrating radar has confirmed treasures inside that would reshape everything we think we know about the ancient world. And still, nobody dares to go in. Not because of the legendary automated crossbows said to be loaded and aimed at every entrance. That threat is ancient. The real danger is modern and measurable. Scientific instruments have detected massive concentrations of liquid mercury flooding the core of the tomb. A shimmering, poisonous sea sitting in perfect stillness beneath the earth. Qin Shi Huang did not build a resting place. He built a weapon, a chemical fortress designed to murder anyone who comes close to disturbing his eternal sleep. 2,000 years later, the weapon is still active. The mercury has not evaporated. The danger has not faded. His tomb is not a monument to death. It is a machine still running. Today, we are going to tear apart the psychology of an emperor who poisoned his own body in pursuit of immortal life. We will walk through the engineering of his underground death trap, layer by layer. And we will explain, with hard science, why cracking open that burial vault could trigger an environmental disaster that no government is willing to risk. Before we go deeper, drop your city and country in the comments below. Take 1 second to subscribe and protect this channel. You are watching Ancestral, the best dark history channel in the world. The ancient world never ran short of kings who mistook their own reflection for a god. Most of them learned the truth when a sword opened their throat or a fever dissolved their organs. Ying Zheng did not suffer from ordinary delusion. He engineered his divinity the way an architect engineers a cathedral, except his building material was human bone. Before he rose, China was not a nation. It was a slaughterhouse divided into 7 warring kingdoms that had been devouring each other for over 2 centuries. War in that age still carried a veneer of ritual. Nobles rode chariots into battle, announced themselves by name, and followed codes of honor inherited from ancestors who believed combat was a conversation between gentlemen. Ying Zheng looked at those traditions and saw weakness. The moment he seized command of the Qin military apparatus, he dismantled every rule of civilized warfare and replaced it with a brutal economy of flesh. He created a promotion system based entirely on confirmed kills. A farmer with no name and no land could rise to the rank of a regional governor if he stacked enough severed heads at the feet of his commanding officer. Rank was not inherited. It was harvested. The Qin war machine did not fight for honor or territory. It fought because every single soldier on the front line was individually incentivized to kill as many human beings as physically possible. The armies moved east like a black tide. Their soldiers wore dark lacquered armor and carried weapons produced on a scale the ancient world had never witnessed. Every bronze blade, every crossbow trigger, every halberd shaft was manufactured to identical specifications. If a component failed in the field, it was swapped out in minutes. No other civilization on Earth had achieved this level of military standardization. It meant that Yingzheng could lose 10,000 men in a single engagement and replace them with 10,000 fresh bodies carrying identical equipment by the following morning. His enemies were still forging swords one at a time in village workshops. They never stood a chance. In 225 BC, Qin forces surrounded the fortified capital of the Wei Kingdom. The walls were thick. A direct assault would have cost tens of thousands of Qin lives. So the generals did not assault. They studied the landscape and noticed a river running close to the city. They ordered their engineers to dig diversion channels. Within weeks, the river changed course. It poured directly into the streets of the capital. The water rose through the foundations, flooded the granaries, collapsed the homes. Hundreds of thousands of men, women, and children drowned in brown water or suffocated under collapsing mud walls. The city did not fall. It was erased, and the Qin army did not lose a single soldier taking it. By 221 BC, all 6 rival kingdoms had been swallowed whole. Every flag had been torn down. Every royal court had been emptied. Yingzheng stood at the center of the largest unified territory East Asia had ever known, and he decided that his old name was no longer large enough to contain what he had become. He abandoned it. He forged a new title from words that had never been combined before. Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor under heaven. No one had ever claimed that name. He intended for no one to ever claim it again. But the conquest of land only solved half the problem. He controlled the present. He did not control the past. And the past was dangerous, because inside the memory of the past lived the blueprints for rebellion. As long as people could read about the old kings, the old philosophies, the old ways of organizing society, they could imagine a world where Qin Shi Huang did not exist. That possibility was intolerable. In 213 BC, his most ruthless advisor proposed a solution so extreme it still echoes through every century since. Destroy the written record. The emperor did not hesitate. He signed the order. Overnight, possessing a book became a crime punishable by death. Soldiers fanned out across the empire. They smashed through doors. They ransacked private libraries and temple archives. They hauled centuries of accumulated wisdom into public squares and set it ablaze. Poetry that had survived 500 years of warfare vanished in an afternoon. Philosophical texts that formed the intellectual backbone of Chinese civilization turned to white ash. The only documents spared were technical manuals on farming, medicine, and the carefully curated official chronicle of the Qin dynasty itself. Anyone caught hiding forbidden texts had their face branded with hot iron and was shipped to forced labor camps on the frontier. The emperor was not simply censoring thought. He was performing surgery on the collective memory of an entire civilization, cutting away every piece that did not serve his image. The scholars did not accept the lobotomy quietly. In 212 BC, whispers of dissent reached the imperial court. Confucian intellectuals in the capital were meeting in secret, discussing the emperor's cruelty, questioning his mandate. Qin Shi Huang did not send spies. He did not open a debate. He ordered the immediate arrest of 460 of the most respected thinkers in the city. They were dragged from their homes in the early morning. They were not brought to a courtroom. They were marched to a wide trench that soldiers had spent the previous day carving into the earth outside the city walls. The scholars were forced to stand at the edge of the pit. Then they were shoved in. They landed on each other, tangled in their robes, gasping. The soldiers picked up their shovels and began filling the trench with dirt. The first layer covered their legs. The second covered their chests. The last covered their screaming mouths. 460 men were buried alive, fully conscious, choking on the soil of the empire they had dared to question. It was not an execution. It was a message carved into the earth itself. There is no history before me. There is no thought outside of mine. With the internal threat neutralized, the emperor turned his gaze to the northern horizon. Beyond the empire's border, the steppe nomads rode in fast, unpredictable waves. They struck farming settlements, burned what they could carry, and vanished before any army could respond. Qin Shi Huang demanded a permanent solution. He ordered the construction of a continuous defensive wall stretching across the entire northern frontier, over mountains, through valleys, across open desert. He did not hire skilled builders. He conscripted them. More than 1 million human beings were torn from their families and marched north. Farmers, petty criminals, political prisoners, disgraced officials. They arrived at the frontier and were handed wooden frames. The method was primitive and devastating. They poured loose soil between the boards and beat it with heavy wooden mallets until it compressed into something harder than brick. They did this in the scorching heat of summer, when the sun could kill a man standing still. They did this in the frozen silence of winter, when exposed skin turned black and fingers snapped off like dry twigs. When a laborer dropped dead from heat exhaustion, dehydration, or starvation, the overseers did not pause the work. Digging a grave meant losing a frame for an hour. Instead, they rolled the corpse into the wooden mold. They poured the next batch of earth on top of the body and kept pounding. The bones of the dead became part of the structure. The wall was not built on the land, it was built on the bodies of the people who built it. Thousands of miles of compressed earth and human remains, standing against the wind as a monument to one man's refusal to feel vulnerable. But even a wall that stretched to the horizon could not protect him from the enemy that lived inside his own chest. In 227 BC, before the conquests were even complete, a man named Jing Kai had walked into the throne room carrying a rolled-up map of surrendered territory. It was a gift, a gesture of submission from a defeated state. The emperor accepted it. As the scroll unrolled across the floor, a blade emerged from the silk. It was a short dagger, and its edge had been soaked in poison. Jing Kai grabbed the emperor by the sleeve and lunged. The fabric ripped. Qin Shi Huang stumbled backward, fumbling for his own sword, which was too long to draw quickly at close range. He ran around a bronze pillar. Jing Kai chased him. The court stood frozen. Finally, a physician hurled his medicine bag at the assassin, buying the emperor a single second. He drew his blade and slashed Jing Kai across the legs. The assassin crumpled. The guards descended and tore him apart. The emperor survived. But something inside his mind did not. From that day forward, Qin Shi Huang became a ghost ruling an empire. He constructed 270 separate palaces linked by covered corridors and walled tunnels so that he could move between them without ever being seen under open sky. He never slept in the same room twice. Any servant who disclosed which palace he occupied that night was killed immediately. Any advisor who held eye contact a moment too long risked the annihilation of their entire extended family. He surrounded himself with walls within walls within walls, and still it was not enough, because the one enemy he could not barricade against was the passage of time. He was aging, his body was weakening, and the throne of the first emperor had no meaning if the first emperor was dead. He launched naval expeditions into the Eastern Ocean, chasing legends of enchanted islands where immortal beings guarded the secret of eternal life. He loaded ships with hundreds of young men and women, provisions for years, and orders to not return without the elixir. The fleets sailed beyond the horizon and were never seen again. Some historians believe they landed in Japan, and simply refused to come back to a madman. Desperate and running out of time, the emperor turned to the men he trusted least and needed most, his alchemists. They told him the answer had been under his feet the entire time. Cinnabar, a deep red mineral pulled from the veins of the earth. When heated in a furnace, cinnabar released a strange, beautiful substance, a silver liquid that moved like water but weighed like stone. Mercury. The alchemists believed it was the bridge between the mortal and the divine, a substance that defied the laws of nature, neither solid nor liquid, immune to rust, immune to age. They ground the cinnabar into fine powder. They compressed it into small red pills. They told the emperor that daily consumption would transform his mortal flesh into something eternal. He swallowed the poison every single day. The mercury slid down his throat, entered his stomach lining, and bled into his bloodstream. It crossed the barrier that protects the human brain. Once inside, it began destroying the myelin sheaths that insulate nerve fibers, the biological wiring that allows thoughts to travel from one neuron to the next. The physical symptoms arrived first. His gums darkened to a deep, infected purple. His teeth began to loosen and shift in their sockets. The hands that once held the jade seal of an empire with iron certainty now trembled without stopping. The tremors climbed from his fingertips through his forearms and into his shoulders. The psychological collapse was far worse. Chronic mercury poisoning does not simply damage the brain. It dismantles the architecture of the self. Qin Shi Huang lost the ability to sleep. When exhaustion finally dragged his eyes shut, he was assaulted by visions of the dead, the millions of faces belonging to the people his wars and walls and purges had consumed. His moods became violent and unpredictable. He could dissolve into uncontrollable weeping over a piece of music, then erupt into homicidal fury because a dish was served at the wrong temperature. His paranoia, already severe, metastasized into full chemical psychosis. He heard phantom footsteps in sealed corridors. He became convinced that the creatures in the ocean were plotting his assassination. He was the most powerful man alive, and he was trapped in a deteriorating mind that could no longer distinguish between the real and the imagined. Even as his grip on reality dissolved, his obsession with what came after death sharpened into something almost mechanical. He knew the mercury pills were failing. He could feel the decay in his own hands. So he made a decision that would outlast every wall, every conquest, every burned book. If he could not live forever above the earth, he would reign forever beneath it. He ordered the construction of an underground empire, not a tomb, a kingdom. 700,000 conscripted laborers were marched to the base of Mount Lee and told to dig straight down. They cut through bedrock. They breached 3 underground rivers and sealed the flooding tunnels with molten bronze. Layer by layer, they carved a subterranean world designed to house not a dead man, but a living god who simply happened to have stopped breathing. If you are still here, you already know this channel does not sugarcoat the past. We do not soften the edges to make history comfortable. That is why I want to invite you to join The Lineage, our exclusive membership community. When you join The Lineage, you are not just supporting a channel. You are funding the research, the long hours, the uncompromising work that makes these stories possible. If you want to stand with us, hit the join button below. Take your place. Keep this machine alive. The first emperor's body finally surrendered in 210 BC. He died during an inspection tour of the eastern provinces, hundreds of miles from the capital. It was deep summer. The heat was savage. His closest ministers understood immediately that the news of his death would detonate the empire, Every conquered state, every silenced faction, every brutalized population was held together by the fear of one man. If that man was confirmed dead, the rebellion would begin before his body was cold. So they sealed the corpse inside his personal carriage and told no one. They continued the procession as though the emperor were alive, issuing decrees in his name, accepting tributes at every stop. But the heat was relentless. Within days, the body began to decompose. The smell of rotting imperial flesh seeped through the wooden walls of the carriage and drifted over the procession like a confession. The ministers improvised. They ordered cartloads of dead, salt-preserved fish to be hauled directly in front of and behind the emperor's carriage. The stench of decaying seafood masked the stench of a decaying god. The man who had unified the largest empire in Asian history was dragged home to his capital, hidden behind a curtain of rotting fish. He was dead. His dynasty would collapse within 4 years. But his true legacy was not the empire he built above the ground. It was the nightmare he sealed below it. Deep in the earth beneath Mount Li, the doors to his underground kingdom were waiting to be shut from the outside. And what lay behind those doors would remain untouched, undisturbed, and lethal for the next 2,000 years. In the spring of 1974, a team of peasant farmers in China's Shanxi province was drilling a fresh water well through the parched topsoil. One of their shovels struck something solid. They assumed it was a boulder. They dug around it, and then a human face emerged from the clay, staring up at them with hollow eyes that had not seen light in 22 centuries. Those farmers had no idea that they had just punched a hole through the outermost security ring of the most dangerous sealed structure ever built by human hands. The Terracotta Army is one of the most recognized archaeological discoveries in modern history. Museums display the statues behind glass. Documentaries film them in golden lighting. Tourist brochures print their faces on postcards. But every single one of those presentations is a lie of omission. The Terracotta Army was never a work of art. It was never a cultural statement. It was a military deployment ordered by a man suffering from chemical psychosis who was preparing for a literal war against the dead. Qin Shi Huang understood the afterlife the same way he understood the living world, as a battlefield. He had personally authorized the extermination of over 1 million human beings during his campaigns of unification. He had buried scholars alive. He had drowned entire cities. He had fed the bodies of his own laborers into the walls of his empire. He knew, with the absolute certainty of a man whose brain was saturated with mercury, that death was not a release. It was an ambush. The spirits of the 6 kingdoms he had crushed were waiting for him on the other side, and they were hungry for revenge. He needed an army that could not bleed, could not starve, could not desert, and could not be bribed. He needed soldiers made of earth. He commissioned the production of over 8,000 individual clay warriors, 130 war chariots, nearly 700 horses. But this was not mass production in the way we understand the term. Every single figure was unique. Each face was sculpted to replicate a specific living soldier from the Qin military ranks. The shape of the jaw, the angle of the brow, the thickness of the lips. Every statue was a portrait of a real killer who had proven himself on real battlefields. The emperor was not filling his tomb with decorations. He was conscripting an immortal frontline division, a wall of fired clay standing between his soul and the fury of every ghost he had created. The world sees those statues today as a uniform brownish gray, rows and rows of earth-colored figures standing in silent formation. That image is a product of destruction, not design. When those warriors were first placed underground, they were blazing with color. Each one was coated in elaborate layers of lacquer and pigment. Han purple, a synthetic color so complex that modern chemists did not fully understand its molecular structure until the late 20th century. Bone white for the armor plates, and a deep, vivid red, the precise shade of fresh arterial blood, painted across their lips and the trim of their robes. They were not standing in a tomb. They were standing in a painted underworld, bright and terrifying. When archaeologists in the 1970s began uncovering the pits and exposing the statues to open air for the first time, something catastrophic happened. The sudden change in humidity and oxygen levels triggered an irreversible chemical reaction in the ancient lacquer. Within 15 seconds of exposure, the paint began to curl away from the clay's surface, like dead skin peeling from a burn. The pigments crumbled into powder and scattered in the breeze. Colors that had survived intact for over 2,000 years inside a sealed, stable atmosphere were annihilated in less time than it takes to draw a breath. The modern world did not unveil the Terracotta Army. It skinned them alive. And that moment was not just a tragedy. It was a prophecy. The atmosphere inside the Emperor's sealed world operates under its own chemical laws. The instant that environment is broken, everything inside it begins to die. That lesson was taught to us by paint-on-clay soldiers standing a full mile from the actual burial chamber. It was a warning shot, and we still have not fully absorbed its meaning. Because the Terracotta Army is not the tomb. It is not even close to the tomb. Those 8,000 warriors stand approximately 1.5 kilometers from the central burial mound. They are the outermost perimeter, the fence line, the first checkpoint. Everything the public has ever seen, every statue photographed, every artifact displayed in a museum, comes from the edges of a complex so vast it defies comparison. The necropolis of Qin Shi Huang is not a grave. It is a subterranean city, spanning nearly 100 square kilometers. The layout was designed as a mirror image of his imperial capital, Xianyang. There are administrative buildings carved from stone, sitting empty in the dark, complete with corridors and chambers as though clerks and ministers might arrive at any moment to begin governing the underworld. There are enormous royal stables, and inside those stables, archaeologists have found the actual skeletal remains of horses that were killed and entombed to serve the emperor in death. The level of detail is not symbolic. It is psychotic. He was not honoring a tradition. He was duplicating his entire world underground and expecting it to function. And the population of that underground city was not limited to clay and animal bone. When Qin Shi Huang died, his son inherited the throne and immediately faced the question of what to do with his father's household. The imperial harem contained hundreds of women. The new emperor issued a decree. Any concubine who had not produced a child for the old emperor was deemed expendable. They were not exiled. They were not released. They were marched down stone ramps into the lower levels of the tomb complex. The massive vault doors were sealed behind them. Inside, the torches they carried consumed the remaining oxygen in the enclosed space within minutes. Hundreds of women suffocated in absolute darkness, their lungs burning for air that was no longer there. They were buried alive so that a dead man would not be lonely in his underground palace. Their bones are still inside those chambers. No one has retrieved them. The craftsmen who built the inner tomb received an identical reward for their service. The ancient historian Sima Qian documented their fate with the cold precision of a man recording a logistics report. The engineers and master artisans who designed and constructed the core chambers knew every detail of the layout. They knew the exact position of every corridor, every doorway, every hidden mechanism. That knowledge made them the single greatest security threat to the tomb's integrity. After the emperor's bronze sarcophagus was lowered into the central vault, the inner stone gate was released from its housing and crashed down into position. The workers who remained in the middle passage heard the impact. They waited. They had been promised payment and release. Instead, the outer gate dropped. The sound of that second slab hitting the floor must have been the last meaningful thing they ever heard. They were sealed between two walls of solid stone. No light, no air circulation, no exit. They had built the most complex underground structure in human history, and their compensation was to die inside it. When archaeologists eventually access the passage between those two gates, they expect to find scratch marks gouged into the stone, the final desperate signatures of men who realized they had been entombed with their own creation. The logic was flawless and inhuman. A dead architect cannot draw a map for a grave robber. Beyond the sealed workers, beyond the sacrificed women, beyond the empty offices and the horse skeletons, the approach to the central chamber is protected by something far more deliberate. Sima Qian described mechanical weapons installed along the corridors leading to the emperor's body. Automatic crossbows, loaded and aimed, rigged to concealed trigger mechanisms designed to fire on anyone who crossed their path. For centuries, mainstream historians dismissed this as legend. The idea that a civilization from the 3rd century BC could engineer autonomous projectile weapons seemed absurd. It does not seem absurd anymore. Excavations of the outer pits have uncovered the trigger mechanisms. They are cast in solid bronze. The arrowheads recovered from surrounding areas are coated in a thin, precise layer of chromium dioxide, an anti-corrosion treatment so advanced that European metallurgists did not develop an equivalent technique until 1900 years later. The crossbow stocks were made of wood, and wood decays over time. But the critical mechanical components, the triggers, the locking pins, the release catches, are all metal, and they have been sitting in an oxygen-free environment since the day they were installed. Anaerobic conditions prevent rust. They prevent decay. They preserve tension. 2 millennia of total stillness in a sealed, airless corridor. The sinew bowstrings have almost certainly lost their original draw weight, but the bronze pressure plates embedded in the floor have not corroded. The gear assemblies have not fused. A single footfall on the wrong stone could still engage a mechanism that snaps a hardened bronze lever into position and sends a chromium-tipped projectile hissing through the dark at chest height. The crossbows may not kill with the force they had in 210 BC, but in a confined stone corridor saturated with toxic vapor, even a superficial wound from a 2,000-year-old bolt would be a death sentence. If you survive the perimeter, if you navigate past the outer army, through the necropolis, beyond the sealed gates and the skeletal remains and the rigged corridors. If you reach the core of Mount Lee without triggering a single mechanism, you arrive at the central burial chamber. And what waits inside is worse than any crossbow. The ceiling of the chamber is an enormous vaulted dome encrusted with pearls and precious stones, arranged to replicate the exact positions of the stars and constellations as they appeared in the night sky above China in the 3rd century BC. It is an artificial heaven. Below it, the floor is a sculpted topographical map of the entire unified Chinese empire, carved in meticulous relief. The mountain ranges rise from the stone in miniature ridges. The coastlines are etched with geographic precision. And the great rivers of China, the Yangtze, the Yellow River, the channels leading to the Eastern Sea, are represented by deep trenches cut into the floor of the chamber. Those trenches are not symbolic grooves. They are functional channels. and they are filled to the brim with liquid mercury. Thousands upon thousands of gallons of the heavy silver metal, extracted by the emperor's alchemists from heated cinnabar ore, poured into the carved riverbeds of a miniature empire. Mercury is 13.6 times denser than water. It is a mirror that moves. It reflects light like polished silver, but flows with a slow, heavy, hypnotic weight that makes it look alive. To the emperor's poisoned mind, it was the substance of eternity, the same material he had been swallowing for years in his quest to defeat death. He filled the rivers of his underground world with it because he believed it would animate his replica empire, keep the rivers flowing, keep the kingdom alive beneath the earth long after the surface world forgot his name. And according to Sima Qian, the Mercury rivers were not meant to sit still. Ancient texts describe concealed mechanical systems designed to keep the liquid metal circulating in a continuous loop. The exact engineering remains unknown. Subterranean water wheels driven by natural water pressure, sealed hydraulic systems exploiting the immense density differential between mercury and groundwater. Whatever the method, the intent was clear. The rivers were supposed to flow permanently. In the total silence of a sealed underground vault, the sound of circulating mercury, 13 times heavier than water, pushing through carved stone channels, would produce a low, dense, rhythmic pulse, a metallic heartbeat echoing through absolute darkness for century after century after century. That mechanical ambition created something the emperor almost certainly did not intend. Mercury is a liquid at room temperature, but it also evaporates at room temperature. In an open environment, the vapor dissipates harmlessly into the atmosphere. Inside a sealed, unventilated stone chamber buried under millions of tons of packed earth, the vapor has nowhere to go. It accumulates. Year after year, decade after decade, century after century, the mercury releases its invisible toxic gas into the trapped air. The concentration builds. The atmosphere inside that chamber has had over 2,000 years to saturate. What exists inside that vault today is not air in any meaningful sense. It is a pressurized cloud of mercury vapor so dense that a single unprotected breath would deliver a lethal dose of heavy metal directly into the lungs, through the alveolar membrane, and into the bloodstream. The chamber is not a room. It is a chemical weapon in a state of permanent readiness, armed by the laws of physics and loaded by the patience of geological time. If you are watching this far into the story, you already understand what this channel is about. We do not polish the past to make it presentable. We crack it open and show you what is rotting inside. That is exactly why the lineage exists. Our membership community is not a fan club. It is the engine that funds the research, the deep dives, and the uncompromising production behind every single episode. If this work matters to you, if you want to stand behind it, hit the join button below this video. Take your place in the lineage. Keep this channel armed and operational. We know the mercury is real. We know the crossbows are real. We know the sealed atmosphere is a ticking chemical clock. Modern science has circled this mound with every instrument available, and every reading that comes back tells the same story. The tomb of Qin Shi Huang is not a historical relic. It is an active hazard. And if anyone ignores the data and forces those doors open, the emperor who spent his life engineering death will reach across 22 centuries and claim his final kills. Modern science carries an unspoken arrogance into every excavation site on the planet. We have instruments that can read the chemical composition of a grain of sand from orbit. We have imaging systems that reconstruct buried structures without moving a single stone. We arrive at ancient sites with the quiet confidence of surgeons entering an operating room, certain that given enough time and enough funding, we can crack open any secret the Earth has swallowed. Mount Lee does not care about our confidence. Mount Lee has been rejecting the modern world for 22 centuries, and it has not lost a single round. What Qin Shi Huang engineered beneath that mound is not a puzzle waiting to be solved. It is a hostage negotiation. The hostages are the most valuable historical artifacts on Earth, and the ransom demand is written in the laws of thermodynamics and toxicology. We can see the outline of the prize through our instruments. We know what is inside, and we know, with absolute scientific certainty, that the act of reaching for it will destroy it. Consider what happened to the paint on the clay soldiers. The Terracotta Army stood in sealed underground pits for over 2,000 years. The atmosphere inside those pits was stable. Low oxygen, consistent humidity, minimal temperature fluctuation. The lacquer and pigment on the surface of the warriors existed in a state of chemical equilibrium with that specific environment. The instant the archaeological team broke through the ceiling of the first pit, that equilibrium shattered. Fresh air rushed in. The oxygen content spiked. The relative humidity dropped like a stone, and the ancient lacquer, which had maintained its molecular integrity for millennia in a sealed cocoon, reacted to the new atmosphere the way a snowflake reacts to a blowtorch. In 15 seconds, the paint curled, cracked, and disintegrated into powder. Colors that had survived the rise and fall of the Roman Empire, the entire medieval period, the Renaissance, the Industrial Revolution, and 2 world wars were obliterated in the time it takes to tie a shoe. 22 centuries of perfect preservation, undone by a single breath of modern air. That was the antechamber. That was the perimeter, the outer ring of a complex that stretches for miles. The core burial vault, the chamber where the emperor's body rests inside its bronze sarcophagus, contains materials infinitely more fragile than lacquer on clay. Ancient texts and archaeological inference suggest the presence of silk scrolls, documents that could contain lost philosophical treatises, imperial decrees, maps of territories we have never seen, records of events that were deliberately erased from history during the book burnings. There are believed to be wooden architectural models, miniature replicas of palaces, and administrative buildings constructed with organic materials that have survived only because they exist in a sealed, oxygen-deprived vacuum. And there are the organic remains of the emperor himself, a body that has been marinating in mercury vapor for 2,000 years, in conditions that no forensic scientist has ever encountered. If an excavation team were to breach the main stone wall of the central chamber, the pressure differential between the sealed interior and the outside atmosphere would equalize in a violent, instantaneous exchange. Outside air, rich in oxygen and carrying the ambient humidity of the Shanxi climate, would flood the vault like water breaking through a dam. Every silk fiber, every wooden joint, every organic molecule that has been held in suspended animation by the absence of oxygen would begin to oxidize on contact. The decay would not be gradual, it would be catastrophic. Silk that has maintained its weave for 22 centuries would crumble into brown dust before a conservator could reach it. Wooden models would warp, crack, and collapse as moisture invaded their desiccated cellular structure. Pigments on interior walls would flash off the surface exactly as the lacquer did on the terracotta soldiers. Except this time, there would be no second copy, no duplicate, no backup. Everything inside that chamber exists as a singular, irreplaceable record of a civilization that deliberately destroyed its own written history. The act of opening the door to observe that record would be the act that annihilates it. We would vaporize the past in the process of trying to look at it. But the loss of artifacts, As devastating as it would be to human knowledge, is the lesser threat. It is the academic tragedy. The scientific community could absorb that loss the way it has absorbed other archaeological disasters, with regret and revised protocols and long papers about what should have been done differently. What the scientific community cannot absorb is the biological crisis that waits behind that same door. For centuries, Sima Qian's account of Mercury rivers flowing through the emperor's tomb was treated the way modern historians treat most ancient descriptions of the supernatural, with polite skepticism and a footnote. Rivers of liquid metal circulating mechanically through an underground chamber sounded like mythology. It sounded like the kind of poetic exaggeration that ancient chroniclers used to elevate their subjects from mortal rulers to divine figures. Nobody took it literally. Then, in the early 2000s, a team of Chinese geophysicists decided to test the legend with modern instruments. They did not attempt to enter the mound. They did not drill into the structure. They climbed to the top of the earthen pyramid and extracted soil samples from various points across the surface. They ran those samples through spectrometric analysis, measuring the concentration of heavy metals in the dirt. The results did not just confirm the ancient texts. They detonated every comfortable assumption the archaeological community had been operating under for decades. The soil on top of the burial mound contained mercury concentrations that exceeded the natural geological baseline by a factor of up to 280. That is not a trace. That is not a residual signature from some ancient industrial process nearby. That is a screaming chemical alarm. And the distribution pattern was not random. The areas of highest concentration mapped precisely onto the locations where Sima Qian said the Mercury rivers representing the Yangtze, the Yellow River, and the Eastern Sea would be. The mercury had been migrating upward through the soil for 2 millennia, slowly seeping through microscopic fissures in the stone and earth. And the pattern it left on the surface was a ghostly topographical echo of the waterways carved into the floor of the chamber below. The legend was not a legend. It was a factual engineering report written 2,000 years before anyone had the instruments to verify it. Beneath that mound, an ocean of liquid mercury has been sitting in a sealed stone vault, evaporating into the trapped air, and slowly poisoning the earth above it for 22 unbroken centuries. Now, consider the physics of what is happening inside that sealed space, and understand why every serious scientist who has studied this site has reached the same conclusion. A single droplet of mercury, smaller than a pea, spilled on the floor of a modern laboratory, is classified as a hazardous materials event. The room is evacuated. A specialized cleanup team is dispatched. Ventilation systems are activated. Protocols are followed to ensure that the vapor from that single tiny droplet does not accumulate to a concentration that could damage the nervous systems of the people working nearby. That is the response to one drop in a ventilated room. The emperor's tomb contains thousands of gallons of liquid mercury spread across a network of channels carved into the floor of a chamber that has been hermetically sealed for over 2,000 years. Mercury evaporates at room temperature. It does so slowly, invisibly, and continuously. In an open environment, the vapor disperses into the surrounding atmosphere and dilutes to harmless concentrations. Inside a sealed stone box with no ventilation, no airflow, and no exit, the vapor has nowhere to go. It accumulates, it saturates, it pressurizes. Every single day for the past 2 millennia, the mercury in those channels has been releasing vapor into the trapped air of the chamber. The concentration has been building with the patience of geology. What exists inside that vault right now is not breathable atmosphere by any medical definition. It is a pressurized reservoir of mercury gas at a concentration so extreme that it has no parallel in any controlled laboratory environment on Earth. No human being has ever inhaled air with that level of mercury saturation, because no human being has ever been foolish enough to create the conditions that produced it. Until now, the only being to have achieved it is a man who has been dead for 2,200 years. If an excavation team were to crack the primary seal of the central chamber, the pressurized vapor would not seep out politely through the gap like steam from a kettle. The pressure differential would cause an eruption. A dense, invisible cloud of mercury gas would blast outward through the breach and into the surrounding tunnel system. The workers closest to the opening would inhale it before they had any chance to react. Mercury vapor enters the lungs, crosses the alveolar membrane into the bloodstream, and reaches the brain within minutes. The symptoms of acute high-concentration mercury inhalation begin with a metallic taste on the tongue and a tightness in the chest. Within hours, the victim experiences violent tremors, loss of coordination, and difficulty breathing. Within days, the heavy metal begins to dismantle the central nervous system. The myelin sheaths that insulate nerve fibers degrade. Cognitive function collapses. The victim experiences hallucinations, paranoid delusions, uncontrollable emotional episodes, and a progressive detachment from reality that mirrors the exact psychological disintegration that Qin Shi Huang himself suffered in the final years of his life. The workers who opened his tomb would die the same death he died, poisoned by the same substance, destroyed by the same chemistry. The emperor's final weapon is not a crossbow or a blade. It is his own medicine, concentrated by time into something far more lethal than anything his alchemists ever imagined. And the danger does not stop at the tunnel entrance. If the breach occurs during certain wind conditions, or if the volume of released gas is large enough to reach the surface, the mercury plume would drift over the surrounding landscape. The tomb of Qin Shi Huang is not located in an empty desert. It is surrounded by agricultural land. Villages, communities of people who farm the soil directly above and around the mound. A significant atmospheric release of mercury vapor would contaminate crops, groundwater, and the air supply of an entire region. The cleanup would take years. The health consequences would last generations. The emperor, with nothing more than heated cinnabar and sealed stone, constructed a weapon that functions identically to a modern dirty bomb. The only difference is that his device has been armed for 2,000 years, and the detonation trigger is human curiosity. Because physical entry is a confirmed death sentence for both the artifacts and the archaeologists, modern science has been forced to fight the tomb from a distance. The most promising technology deployed so far is cosmic ray muon tomography. The principle is elegant and almost absurd in its scale. Muons are subatomic particles generated when cosmic rays from distant supernovae collide with atoms in Earth's upper atmosphere. These particles rain down on the planet's surface continuously, passing through solid matter the way light passes through glass, but losing energy at a rate proportional to the density of the material they encounter. By positioning highly sensitive detectors around and beneath the burial mound, physicists can measure the absorption patterns of muons passing through the structure and reconstruct a three-dimensional density map of the interior. It functions like a medical imaging scan performed on a mountain, using particles born in the death of distant stars. The results have confirmed the presence of walls, chambers, and a large central anomaly consistent with the bronze sarcophagus described in ancient texts. The broad architecture of the tomb has been outlined in shadow form, but muon imaging operates at the resolution of density, not detail. It can tell us that a solid object exists in a specific location. It cannot tell us what that object looks like. It cannot read the text on a bamboo scroll. It cannot identify the contents of a sealed bronze vessel. It cannot map the position of a trigger mechanism or determine whether a crossbow is still under tension. The most advanced particle physics the 21st century can produce has been reduced to staring at blurred silhouettes through a wall it cannot breach. We can see that the emperor is in there. We can see the shape of his kingdom, but we cannot touch it. We cannot read it. We cannot enter it. We are standing outside a locked door with the most expensive flashlight in human history, and all it shows us is the vague outline of something extraordinary that we are forbidden to reach. The official position of the Chinese government and the global archaeological establishment is that the tomb will remain sealed until preservation technology advances to the point where the interior can be safely stabilized during excavation. That is the public statement. It is diplomatic, it is reasonable, and it is not the full truth. The full truth is simpler and far more uncomfortable. We have not opened the tomb because we are afraid of it. Not afraid of the crossbows, not afraid of the political consequences, afraid of the chemistry, afraid of the physics, afraid that the moment we break the seal, we will trigger a chain of destruction that cannot be reversed, and that no technology currently in existence can prevent. We are afraid because we have already seen what happens when we open even the outer edges of this complex. We watched the paint vanish from the clay soldiers in 15 seconds. We measured the mercury concentrations in the soil above the chamber. We calculated the vapor pressure inside a sealed stone vault after 2,000 years of continuous evaporation. And every calculation, every measurement, every data point leads to the same conclusion. Opening that door is not archaeology, it is detonation. Qin Shi Huang spent his life conquering the living. He burned the past so thoroughly that entire philosophical traditions survived only as fragments quoted in other texts. He buried the thinkers who challenged him. He fed the workers who served him into the walls of his own monuments. He swallowed the poison that destroyed his mind because he believed it would make him eternal. And then, in his final act, he designed a tomb that would defeat the future. He weaponized the mercury that killed him. He sealed it in a chamber engineered to concentrate its lethality over centuries. He surrounded it with mechanical traps built from materials that resist the decay of time. And he buried the entire complex under a mountain of earth so massive that it altered the landscape of central China. 2,200 years later, he is still winning. He is still exactly where he chose to be. Undisturbed, untouched, unreachable, floating in a sea of liquid poison inside a pressurized chemical vault beneath a man-made mountain, surrounded by an army of faceless soldiers and the bones of the people he dragged into the dark with him. Every empire that rose after his has crumbled. Every dynasty that followed his has been erased. The Romans are gone. The Mongols are gone. The British Empire is a memory. But Qin Shi Huang is still holding his ground. He is the only ruler in the history of civilization who issued a command that the future has been unable to disobey. Do not enter. And for 22 centuries, nobody has. His tomb is not a relic. It is not a monument. It is a standing order from a dead emperor, and the entire modern world is still obeying it. Thank you for walking through the dark with us until the very end. Hit the subscribe button, leave a like, and share this video with someone who needs to understand what real power looks like when it refuses to die. You have just watched another premium documentary by Ancestral, your ultimate dark history destination on YouTube. The journey does not end here. The video appearing on your screen right now is the next chapter waiting for you. Click it. Watch it immediately. We will meet you on the other side.